Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Blue Lineage podcast series. On today's episode, we're going to talk about some of the first electric blues players, in addition to a continued discussion about jump blues and some of the early R&B players, and actually add another radio DJ to the timeline. Once again, you can follow along with the timeline on bluelineage.com under the timeline section. It's starting to fill out a little bit here. We're getting close to some of the more current genres as we edge into R&B and rock and roll. And this episode, we can definitely start to see the beginnings, the makings. You know, we've talked about how there's been bits, fragments from some of the early players that already kind of built into rock and roll and some of the later genres, but now we're really starting to get into those elements, and it starts to get a little bit blurry as far as what is R&B, when does it fully shift into R&B, and when does it shift into rock and roll. But before we do that, I'm going to actually talk about the only terminology piece on the timeline in this episode, and that would be jump blues. And I already basically covered this last episode, but the jump blues is what people referred to as what was R&B. When you listen to like Louis Jordan on this podcast, we talk about Roy Brown. You can hear what that style is and why it was used or referred to as early R&B, but the jump blues is distinctly different. It has like a swing style. It's more of a swing style, a blues with a swing style, essentially. And as I said, it shifts into R&B over time. It kind of becomes a little bit indistinguishable. And one of the main reasons for this is that both of these kind of evolved in the same way, and jump blues is really the result of urbanization and the migration of blues musicians from the rural areas to the cities, and now you have a lot of people who have practiced in jazz disciplines, or we talked about boogie woogie, and all these guys are kind of coming together in cities, and you're getting these new sounds. And at the time, jump blues was one of those early sounds, one of the early results of urbanization and the transfer of black people not only to cities, but moving from the south to the north, and at this point to the west coast too, as we talked about, mentioned a little bit as in the second migration. You have a lot of people coming from south to the west. Before it was mostly black people moving from the south to the north. Excuse me, one moment. Have a little dry mouth. Sorry about that. So here we go. So that was the jump blues, and the only other part of the jump blues is, like we talked about with Louis Jordan, another big component contribution to the future of music. The jump blues was one of the first music genres that really featured a smaller band specifically before like the electronic technology and influence came to music, when you just had everything was acoustic. You had horns, you had very dominant singers who could kind of cut through the horns without amplification, and you have unamplified string instruments, including stand-up bass and guitar, saxophone, those types of instruments. You had a big band format usually, so you could project to the audience. But once electronic technology kind of came into place, and just amplification technology in general, including microphones, you saw it much more common to reduce big band to combo bands, which is 3 to 5 players, band members versus 7 to 10 or more. And that's something that we talked about with Louis Jordan as being a contribution. They were one of the first big bands to make it big using that format. It really contrasts to some of the other styles that are going on. It has a swing sound, but another component of jump blues is that it was going to be at a faster tempo in comparison to like a slower kind of jazz sound like Nat King Cole, which the way it was played, it resembled what a jump blues would sound like, but at a much slower sort of lounge, slow pace. So that's the jump blues. For a definition will be up on the website. It's pretty clear, pretty concise. When you listen to it, it's very jazzy, very jazz oriented, but you'll be able to hear frequently like a shuffle sort of pattern. Blue notes, some of the characteristics of blues, and then as you move forward, like with Roy Brown is a good example of someone who is really starting to cross over to more of an R&B sound. Louis Jordan was a very distinct jump blues sound, and as Roy Brown comes in the picture, you start to hear more of a R&B, but also Roy Brown is in the contention for one of the first rock and roll songs. So everything starts to get a little bit muddled at this point, and it becomes really interesting. The genre discussion becomes very interesting because we see this natural evolution in black music from blues now to jump blues, and getting R&B components, and we're starting to see, you look at today's genres, and we're starting to see how everything kind of gets segmented over time, even though the lineage is very clear, and that's, I think, something very unique about just trying to talk about black music, where if you're talking about other genres like country, or you're talking about jazz, there are many different, especially with jazz, there are many different subgenres or different types of jazz, but it still kind of is contained in one genre. And you can definitely make the argument, just because of the structure of jazz, that everything kind of fits. But it is interesting with black music, I think, at least to talk about, as for how everything just kind of got broken into so many genres when there's a clear lineage. But at the same time, when you're listening to music, you can be like, hey, this is R&B, or this is funk, this is hip hop, this is rock and roll. But it's an interesting discussion, something to talk about, and how the industry kind of played a role in that whole evolution and how everything was segmented. Anyways, though, let's get to the artists. And our first artist on the list, as you can see on the timeline, 1943, moving right along, we have Muddy Waters. And Muddy Waters is another one of the musicians. I think we talked about Robert Johnson last episode. They talk about the blues. He's probably one of the most famous artists that we've talked about so far, despite having only a few records or recordings. Muddy Waters is another one of those big names, and what's interesting about Muddy Waters as it pertains to the timeline is that there's no song listed for him on the timeline. When I put him up on the website or finish out his profile on the website, there probably will be sample songs, so definitely check him out, because I think one of the things about Muddy Waters is that he has a big catalog, and it's just good to go through a lot of different songs to capture what his sounds were. But the reason that he doesn't have songs listed on the site or the timeline is because the big thing about Muddy Waters was his move, as part of the second migration, as we talked about. A ton of musicians and just black people in general were leaving the South, this is the second generation, second migration, leaving the South, going north. More people were going west this time, and so with that became, as we said, collaborations and also new audiences into the city. So a lot of those audiences, you know, you could cater differently to them than what the current city music, current sounds were. And prior to that, we saw many of these Delta blues musicians travel and go on tour, but they were bringing their Delta blues sounds or some of the more country blues, some of those, older styles of blues into the city, and it became pretty popular. None of these musicians really blew up for their time, as we've kind of reviewed. A lot of them, a number of them had hits, but most of them who were the Delta blues style did not blow up because their music was not really adapted for the audience. They were kind of just seen as it was kind of a specialty music, niche music. Didn't necessarily, reach a wide band of individuals till later on, once people had kind of discovered, like when we talked about Al Lomax, I think is his name. He was searching for Robert Johnson. He was from the Library of Congress, and he couldn't find him. He found out that Robert Johnson had passed away, but he had heard, some of his early recordings, and that was kind of a similar story that we saw for other blues musicians, that people were hearing the blues, fascinated by it, interested in it, and they would go searching for somebody who could play it, not necessarily, a specific individual, but someone who was proficient in this art form. And that changed, starting with Muddy Waters. As he moved to the city, he was originally a Delta blues musician, but of course he really changed the sound, evolved the sound, and adapted it to something that fit for this new culture, this new urban lifestyle that was developing in some of these cities. And a lot of Muddy Waters songs are really adapted versions of previously written or recorded songs from guys like Willie Dixon and Son House. There's some other examples, but a lot of his big hits that he weren't written by him. He adapted them, and so with the timeline, we tried to pay as much homage as we could to some of the original songwriters and creators of the original music and sounds that were associated with the blues and these other genres. We try to include them as much as possible in the timeline to make sure they get credit. And you can't really argue with how great a songwriter Muddy Waters was himself, or how much he contributed to the sound of the electric blues, and that is what we wanted to capture more so than these songs they readapted that were written by other people. Not to take anything away from it, because those versions, were successful for a reason, but really the reason he was included in the timeline was to really capture how his shift from being a Delta blues musician from Mississippi and moving to Chicago was such a big thing at the time. So Muddy Waters was, as I said, originally from Mississippi. He got his nickname from his grandmother because he liked to play inside in puddles or some form of water or mud. He liked to be outside, basically. And so he got the name Muddy, and then Waters was added later. He took on that name, but his original name was McKinley Morganfield. And it's, as I said, he grew up in Mississippi, and he actually only was in school until the third grade. After the third grade, he ended up working, helping out in the fields. His mother, part of it was because his mother had passed away when he was 3 years old, and he went to live with his grandmother. And so he only went to school for 3 years. And since he wasn't in school and was in the plantation fields, he was able to, do some activities that some kids would often not be able to partake in. He learned the harmonica and was able to focus a little bit on music. He actually didn't switch to guitar until he was 17 years old. And then around that time and a little bit later, as he was learning guitar, he also had an opportunity to run a roadhouse for a short amount of time, which booked some mid to small to mid acts. Blues musicians were coming through, and so the Roadhouse put on performances. He also sold bootlegged alcohol. It's partially in the times of Prohibition, although I'm not sure what the Prohibition dates were, so I'm not sure if it was a hard Prohibition or if it was just selling bootlegged alcohol because it was harder to acquire. I'm not 100% sure. That's not my area of expertise. But I know that was a well-known activity. People used to, one of the, legends about Muddy Waters is him selling, kind of running around with bootleg alcohol, but it wasn't really as played out as people said it was. It was more so that he was running a roadhouse that also sold bootlegged alcohol. Anyways, so one thing about Muddy Waters is if you listen to early Muddy Waters, he's actually just playing Delta blues. No electric guitar. He's just playing, the classic country blues, Delta blues style. And, of course he doesn't shift anything else until later. But his early style, which he modeled after like Son House and Charlie Patton and Robert Johnson, of course. And because he was so proficient of this, Alan Lomax, who I just mentioned a little bit before, he was from the Library of Congress. He was looking for Robert Johnson. Well, he couldn't find him because Robert Johnson, by the time he got down to where Robert Johnson was supposed to be, he had passed away already. And he heard Muddy Waters play, or he heard that Muddy Waters could play the Delta blues in similar ways. And so he sought out Muddy Waters and did some recordings with him. And that brought him some success. He got follow-up recordings with Alan Lomax the next summer. And he soon recorded his first, in 1950, he soon recorded his first song called Rolling Stone. And that is important because the Rolling Stones named themselves after this song. And so during this time, he continued to play in small venues. He was still in the South generally. He kind of was, developing his sound. And he also still was working on the plantation as a sharecropper. And finally, this lifestyle was only going to get him so far. So he decided to move to Chicago, like many others decided at that time, but especially for a musician and a musician who wanted to accomplish the things that he wanted to accomplish. Chicago was a good destination for him. That's where that was kind of the center of one of the main centers of new music at the time, especially in the North. So once he gets to Chicago, he continues to work some odd jobs. Remember, he only has a third grade education, so that's going to limit certain, his ability to do certain jobs. He never learned how to read or write. And while he was doing these odd jobs, he would perform, work as a sideman at some Chicago clubs in the South Side. And one thing about these urban clubs is that, Muddy Waters actually has a booming voice, a pretty loud voice, which is a little bit, it's not unique um, for a musician at that time, but as we get into some of these later musicians, especially as I was talking about before, about shifting from big bands to smaller bands, one of the things was the ability to amplify vocals. And, you back in the day, either you didn't have a microphone or microphone technology was not what it was, certainly not what it was as it is today. So, you needed to have that voice that just naturally projects. That was kind of a requirement. And as we go later into the timeline, and talk about some of these later artists, the microphone really allows musicians that don't naturally have that projection or loud voice to, successfully record songs and record in a live atmosphere, especially just because, their voice is that amplified. But the sound of the clubs still was pretty rowdy, and so that was one of the reasons that led him to switch to electric guitar. I mean, by the time he switches to electric guitar, it was already musicians were already doing it. He was one of the first musicians that became well known and created hits with it and really, ran with it and created his own style. But that amplified guitar plus his naturally, loud booming voice amplified, really was a core feature of his sound. It really worked out nice because now he has a amplified guitar. If you have a naturally booming voice, you're in loud clubs, so your voice is amplified, but your guitar is not necessarily amplified like your voice. So now your voice is cutting through, but your guitar is. So you would think as a musician, if that's the case, you might, sing or perform differently, just because you want your guitar parts, you want the other parts of the song to come out, and so the combination of this was definitely a huge component of the sound, and really worked out nicely. So he kept recording at the clubs. He also got signed by Aristocrat Records, which later became the well-known recording company Chess Records, and he basically recorded for Chess Records for, that was basically his recording company for the longest time. And one of the things about Muddy Waters' sound and style is when you listen to him, his electric blues really just sounds like Delta blues electrified. It's a little bit contrasting to some of the later electric blues artists who, were really reshaping blues into something new, a new sound, using some of the abilities and different attributes of the electric guitar to, create different sounds or different styles within the electric blues. But Muddy Waters, especially early on, you can tell that he's just kind of playing guitar, electric guitar, as almost as if it was an acoustic guitar with some key differences. If you listen to a song like Honeybee, I don't remember if on the studio recording if he uses a slide or not, but I believe that he's not, at least in some of the recordings, he's not using a slide, and he's sort of just quickly sliding his finger, up the neck as if it was a slide, but since it's amplified, you don't necessarily need a slide in the same way that you would on an acoustic guitar, so he's kind of simulating a slide, but it's not. It's just an electric guitar. So he's sort of adapting a little bit. You'll hear some. I think he doesn't really bend notes that much. That's definitely something that comes. The art of string bending is something that's definitely more heavily utilized later, and it's not something that was overly utilized with definitely not Delta blues. That's kind of where the slide came in, and then bending in a lot of ways mimics that sort of seamless um, um, you know note hitting higher notes without moving, shifting frets or positions, and it kind of keeps that continuous sound, which if you don't have a slide with an acoustic guitar, it does not quite work out that way. You can bend obviously on an acoustic guitar, but it's definitely different. And so you don't really hear much of that with Muddy Waters, especially early, and he doesn't really ever become a prolific string bender. It's not many of the early electric guitars were huge string benders, but there are a couple who definitely start to implement that in their music, and he still did play with a slide at times, and so it really does have a country blues sort of sound on electric guitar, and that's kind of how it continued to stay throughout his career. But what he did create is a good template that a lot of other artists, of course, emulated, or he influenced many other artists, because regardless of it being a sort of electrified Delta blues, it was still a completely different sound than what had been occurring before. Electrified blues. If you listen to Muddy Waters and you listen to any of the previous Delta blues musicians, it's still a very different sound, even though he's taking a lot of styles and just kind of moving them over. But he definitely did work to make sure it worked out, and adapted a sound that worked in the electric blues sort of realm. So by the late 1950s, he had gained international interest and recognition, and so he was able to tour England. He played a lot of big venues and festivals in the U.S. and in England. And of course, one of the things about that is, with a lot of these, especially now in the electric blues time period, a lot of the artists that we know of, I talked about a little bit before with well, I can't really think today. Yes, Champion Jack Dupree. Okay. We talked about before Champion Jack Dupree and how he went over to Europe and was successful there and played with a number of the artists that we associate with the British invasion. The Beatles opened for him. He had encounters with Eric Clapton. I don't remember who else, but it was starting to become a pattern. We'll talk about it again with some later artists, but the England, parts of Europe were definitely really taking in the blues, and of course that sound returns back to the U.S. later as what people will refer to as a British invasion of rock and roll, blues rock. So Muddy Waters obviously influenced a number of musicians, and part of that was, in his bands contained quite a few pretty well-known musicians who had solo careers simultaneously or later on, including Otis Spann, Jimmy Rogers, Little Walter, Junior Wells, James Cotton, and so and Buddy Guy is another one that we know of, pretty well known. And Buddy Guy, still alive. So if you haven't seen him, he's one of the few people that I will mention while talking about the timeline who's still alive. Well, in the blues era. Obviously, later down the road, there's a number of people who are still alive and performing, but not that many. So that kind of encompasses Muddy Waters. As far as it's relevant to the timeline, I don't really get into a whole lot of his individual songs, but once again, definitely check out Muddy Waters, listen to his sound, find your favorite songs by him, because he's a pretty extensive catalog, definitely very important to the evolution of music, American music, black music, blues, rock and roll, covers. It's definitely one of those root musics that people will pulled from for a long time. That leads us to our next artist. If you look on the timeline, Louis Jordan is listed again. He's listed multiple times on the timeline for different songs. And as we talked about last episode, that little span of success for Louis Jordan and his band was one of the most successful spans for any band in music history. So we see him a few more times, but I'm not going to talk about him again. The next person on the timeline is another DJ, our second DJ on the timeline. The first was Jack Cooper, and we'll mention him a little bit while I'm talking about this individual, Al Benson. So Al Benson, also known as Arthur Bernard Leaner, he grew up also in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, and when he was younger, he performed with his family band. He performed a little bit in black vaudeville, and he also produced shows. So he had some early exposure to music and entertainment. In the 1920s, he moved to Chicago, and he mostly lived in Chicago, except for part of the Great Depression. He did go back to the Mississippi area, but generally he was, at that point he lived in Chicago, and he had a number of jobs. He worked as a probation officer, he worked as a railroad cook, a preacher, and he worked as a interviewer for the Works Progress Administration, which, for those who don't know, the Works Progress Administration was part of the New Deal that was put into place by FDR following the Great Depression to create jobs. It is the portion of that bill that was responsible for rebuilding or enhancing America's infrastructure, roadways and whatnot. And so, Benson was, I guess, in some ways, an early social worker, or one of the early administrations in social services in the country. So that is a little bit interesting, I suppose. So he started his career under the name Reverend Arthur Leaner. As I just mentioned, he worked as a preacher, and he would broadcast. He had 15-minute broadcasts initially from his church, but the problem was that many of the nearby station owners um, were complaining about him advertising, because he would advertise for his radio station to help fund it. And at the time, you know, obviously this is during these times there was racial tensions and a lot of stuff going on, so it's hard to know what the truth was and how much was just a situation of the times as far as how people viewed how religious activities should be, how they should take place. And in this case, they were saying, a religious broadcast should not have advertising, because it could, it shouldn't have private interest or commercial interest, mixed in with, a religious broadcast. It's kind of like the idea behind the separation of church and state. The kind of keeping integrity. You don't want to keep religious integrity for a religious broadcast. So I don't know how much where that was coming from, but regardless, Al Benson, he switched his name to Reverend Arthur Leaner switched his name to Al Benson, and he became a commercial DJ. He started working for a station. So I mean, another component going back to this religious broadcast is at this point, he's essentially has a church, and he's using his church as a radio station. And so now what has happened is he no longer owns a radio station for this point, and now he's working for radio station owners. So, there's definitely other commercial incentives for him not to, have his church radio station. But I don't know. I have never seen any other information about the details surrounding that whole situation. So if you have some knowledge about it, definitely let me know. So he switched his name to Al Benson. He's a commercial DJ. He was working for multiple radio stations in Chicago. By 1948, he was broadcasting 10 hours per week on various stations. And he had some creative control, which was big for black DJs at the time. And one of the things that I talked about with Jack L. Cooper, which he was really the first black DJ, and eventually black creative radio programmer. So he was able to kind of shift the radio content during that time from kind of it was number one, music was, you didn't hear a lot of like music associated with the black community, like jazz or gospel. So Jack L. Cooper helped try to shift that and put that into the radio space, and he also changed the programming on the radio from, a lot of programming was made at the expense of black people, a lot of black caricatures and, just not positive things about black people, or not positive things about black culture. So Jack L. Cooper was able to shift that and include that in radio. And so when Al Benson comes along, there's still a lot of the same stuff going on. Jack L. Cooper also broadcasted in Chicago. And so a lot of the stuff was still going on, though. And so he did some of the same things as far as providing a different perspective. He one of the main differences though was when Jack L. Cooper came along. It was really much earlier. At least when he started, it was much earlier in urban life for the black community. There's a lot of people who were there was not as many people who had moved to the city. So now at this point, there's even a greater demand for different different types of radio stations and radio stations that include all these new black residents, in this case Chicago, who are who are um, who are new to the area and are a lot of young people, a lot of you know people getting into different industries. People at this point people are black people are becoming a much more significant portion of the population. So as we talked about with Muddy Waters, we're talking about black clubs on the South Side, black owned clubs, and so there's just businesses. There's a lot of it's a different industry or a different commercial economy than it was when Jack Cooper came to Chicago at the time. I mean, he was around for quite a while, so there's a point where they overlap, I believe. But one of the main criticisms that I talked about with Jack L. Cooper is that he put jazz on the radio, he put gospel on the radio, but just like with a lot of the other groundbreaking musicians that I talked about, when you talk about Mommy Smith or W.C. Handy, when you're put into these positions where you're trying to add a new sound or a new form of art or entertainment into a space, you can kind of get wrapped up in a kind of a singular ideology or a mission, as far as what you're trying to accomplish. In the case of W.C. Handy, he wanted to become a successful black musician in a time where that just wasn't really happening, and so especially for certain genres of music. And so he of course took the blues and made his interpretation of it, kind of turned into like a little bit of a ragtime song. And during the process of his career, he had to be part of minstrel shows. He had to do this and that was not really great for for himself to have to go through those sort of blackface and entertainment that was pretty demeaning to black culture. He kind of had to make a decision, make a sacrifice, and decide that, oh, this is my mission and this is what I want to do. With Jack L. Cooper, it was a little bit different. He didn't really have to. He did have to early radio. He had to kind of carry out skits and plays that were not good for black culture. Well, I don't want to say not good. I mean, they weren't good, but they were not respectful or positive for black culture, black people. So, but then when he got the opportunity to create his own programming, he really wanted to illuminate that black people, black culture was respectable. There was a black middle class that was growing in the city. He wanted to appeal to them. He wanted to show that, black people can be, civilized and, have a speak eloquently. And so in the process of that, he played gospel and jazz, but he didn't really play the blues. He didn't really play, certain jazz, but most jazz he did play. He didn't really play, a lot of these other up-and-coming genres, which would have been like the jump blues or like early R&B. Some of these styles at the time, of course, were viewed as, too raunchy, lyrically just inappropriate, promoting these unholy, notions, against the church, a lot of these types of things. And so, in the process of trying to promote black culture, he alienated a number of people, and he was a big community guy. That was his focus. As I said, when you have to go through all this, you might develop a singular mission. You might not be trying to be all encompassing. You're really trying to almost prove to the people who were holding you back or said, this and that, said disparaging things about black people or you, as part of black culture, and you're trying to prove them wrong. He was a great community person. He gave back to the community. He did a lot of great things. So, as I said in the episode, not to take anything away from Jack L. Cooper, but that, is a criticism, and, it's valid to a certain extent, because, there is, alienating a large part of the population, especially at that time, and, removing a portion of, a pretty staple portion of black culture, art forms that we're talking about, the struggles and the livelihood, and the experience of black people at the time was, it was important to get out there, but, it's understandable, and, one person can only do so much. So what Al Benson comes in and does, even though he is part of the church, and that was one of the things for Jack L. Cooper and a lot of people. A lot of these genres were a little bit raunchy and not, well, at least at that time. If you read the lyrics and today's, compare it to today's modern music, it seems pretty mild, but nonetheless, it's seen as countercultural and inappropriate in a lot of ways. But Al Benson, just even though he's a reverend, he can see, what the music is. You can see the music for what it is, and saw past that. He included a lot of the songs, blues songs, early R&B, a lot of these genres that were becoming popular in the city, that weren't played before. So for a lot of people, for black and white audiences, they were for the first time hearing some of these genres or songs, and that was big, and that was a huge contributor to just the overall popularity of the current development of music, but also giving some respects to some of the Delta blues guys and country blues guys of before. So it was a pretty big deal. And another thing about Al Benson is he had more of like a down home personality or way of talking, in comparison to Jack L. Cooper or other DJs at the time. And so he appealed once again to a lot of people who were just moving in the city, who weren't familiar with the city life, city ways, and even people who weren't. When you have that kind of when someone seems like they're being themselves and coming from a place of familiarity, I think that goes a long way. And that was something that, some of it was time. As I said before, Jack L. Cooper, you have to some degree adapt to the times. And, Al Benson is getting a start later on. So a lot of this is more acceptable. But either way, it was a big thing, and it was a good move. So Al Benson, continued to do his thing for a while until the late 1950s, early 1960s. And around then, unfortunately, there are a few things. One of the things is that a lot of the station managers had started to shift to a more prescribed song list. So, DJs didn't really have the freedom to play what they wanted to. And part of that, though, was because it was discovered that it was found out that DJs or recording companies were paying DJs off to play certain records. And I mean, don't want to say that Al Benson was part of this, but that was just, kind of widespread thing that happened. And so DJs just lost a lot of choice on what was played. And another thing was, a lot of the advertising models were shifting. And so that was another thing that was lost for DJs, because Al Benson was a very well-known, prolific advertiser. He was really good at getting, putting products out there and getting stuff, bought and sold. And so eventually he faded away a little bit as far as popularity, but he continued to DJ for a while, for a long time. But that was kind of the reason for his slow decline. And that was something that was really happening across the board with radios as they shifted to a more commercial format. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about, I believe we have 2 more DJs on the list that we'll talk about. I think we talk about both of them in the next episode, so we'll get into radio a little bit more. Next on the list is a very well-known singer, at least during his time, and that is Roy Brown. He's also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in this episode, he's also the contender for having made one of the first rock and roll songs ever. That song is Good Rocking Tonight, and it may sound familiar for multiple reasons. I'll mention it a little bit later, but multiple artists performed the song, and each of them experienced their own level of success for recording the song. But Roy Brown is originally from Louisiana. He got his start singing in churches, and as a young adult, he moved to LA. He wanted to try to be a boxer at first, and then when that didn't work out, he actually went back to LA for a period of time and tried to become a singer. So he found his first success actually in Texas, and his first success was Good Rocking Tonight as one of his first hit. And what had happened with that song is he had written the song, and his friend, and also actually one of his idols was Wynonie Harris, and so he actually tried to give the song to Wynonie Harris first before recording it itself, and Wynonie Harris didn't want it at the time, and so he recorded it, and it was a big hit, and potentially the first rock and roll song. And then after that, Wynonie Harris recorded a version. And so, there's a debate. Part of the debate is, is it the first rock and roll song ever? That's like if you're not already familiar, there's quite a debate. There's like a number of songs that people have in the running. On this timeline, it would probably be the first one. But the timeline is not necessarily structured to discover the first rock and roll song, but this is the first contender that is on our list. I mentioned in another episode, Saturday Night Fish Fry is another song that people talk about because of the overdriven guitar, and they use the word rocking, which obviously this song also uses rocking, and that came out a couple years later, and I talked about that as being an early contender for rock and roll. So I think, depending on what you think when you listen to this song, that could eliminate that as a contender. But I don't think this timeline is necessarily for determining that aspect. We definitely don't have enough of the early rock and roll songs to kind of try to figure it out. But if there's any input thoughts about it. I'm definitely open to the debate. I personally don't, you know, I don't have a favorite for which one should be known as the first. But I think this is a good contender. It's good rocking tonight. It sounds like it would be a rock and roll song. But part of the debate is actually between Roy Brown's and Wynonie Harris's versions, because Roy Brown's, well, so Wynonie Harris is a little bit more upbeat. It's a little bit more, I guess, intense in comparison. And then, um, excuse me. And then we'll talk about the last version in a second. One of the interesting things about Good Rocking Tonight is that it has a beat that would later be known as a diddly beat. And the diddly beat was actually kind of big more so for funk than anything, and then later hip hop. But it was, Bo Diddley was known in the rock and roll and blues era, and the diddly beat actually has West African connection, and so it's interesting just because this is present. It's present in other genres. It was present in jazz, but one of the things when we get to Bo Diddley on the timeline is it was a big deal when that became a portion of this side of the lineage in the blues lineage, R&B, rock and roll, and funk. And so it is interesting that it's introduced earlier in the timeline and becomes a part of rock and roll. And another thing about the song is just based on the time it was recorded, it would have been released still as race music, as we talked about before. Early music that was made by black people and deemed for black people was called race music, not with the exception of jazz. So it would have been released as race music, but this was right near the crossover when the charts and record companies started to shift their labeling to R&B, and so it would have been released as a race record, but it would have hit the charts as an R&B hit. So a little interesting. We'll talk about the charts and whatnot a little bit more in, I think it's next episode. Yeah, because that's when we'll talk about the transition from race music to R&B a little bit more. So his version was successful. Wynonie Harris's version, maybe a little bit more rock and roll, but also successful, even more successful. But neither was as famous or as successful as Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley recorded his, I'm not sure when it was, but it became like a gold. It went gold selling album or whatever it's whatever it would be called. But super successful. And that's a trend that happens especially now. Well, not now, but now in the timeline, in the 1950s, 1960s. It definitely happened earlier also, but just artists re-recording a more culturally appropriate or more radio-friendly, just basically sometimes some people might say watered down alternate version. This happened numerous times where these type of versions were re-recorded and then became more successful because they were released into into a different genre. They would be released on the pop charts, or, the rock and roll charts don't really exist until much later. And then, of course, later on, the charts became a little bit less race-based. Of course, right now we're shifting from race to R&B charts. So you see artists later on, not just black artists, some white artists entering those charts. But it stays. The racial lines stay pretty firm, generally speaking. Uh, for a long time, and so, but that was common. Re-records and the other artists who record it and have the more radio-friendly version become more successful and have a bigger hit than their original recording artist. And often the original recording artists, one of the reasons that some of these artists are included in the timeline and not well known was because of just that. People recording more successful versions of their music without necessarily giving the credit, or even the credit is due. The artist is not adequately compensated, or it's just a product of the times in which you can say what you want, but what's done has been done. You've created essentially copied their music and made a more popular version of it, and some people will say that's fair. I don't know. It's definitely a discussion to be had. Roy Brown's biggest hit, most well-known hit, was Harlow Blues, which is definitely a slow blues song. So it's a little bit of a departure from what, most of his songs were more of like a jump blues, early R&B style, kind of a rock and roll. But Harlow Blues was, and which is his most famous song, was definitely a blues hit, and it was released in 1950, and it reached number 1. So it's kind of interesting. He was known for his somewhat scandalous lyrics. He has really unique voice. If you ever haven't listened to Roy Brown, definitely check him out, because he has a very interesting voice. His lyrics for that time were seen as a little bit more scandalous, a little bit, I won't even say raunchy, because if you look at them, it can be a little bit hard. You can see how they're a little bit suggestive in some situations, but it's kind of hard to exactly see where the controversy would come in. But that was, he was a big influence on guys like Elvis. Obviously, he re-recorded one of his songs, but we were entering into that era where a lot of these artists are the styles are trending towards the pop genre. You'll see a lot of pop artists start to mimic and borrow, or emulate, as I was just kind of saying, these styles and these lyrics and the songs all together in some cases. Of course, with Elvis, Roy Brown is one. Another one that people will talk about is Jackie Wilson, as far as, where he got a lot of his, where he potentially got a lot of his influence from, among other places. And so basically within that time period, 1947, 1952, he had another number of other hits. That was kind of definitely the peak of his career. And he kept touring after that, but, that was kind of the peak of his success. We didn't really see a whole lot after that. And that's Roy Brown, great singer. He definitely contributed to, I think, in a similar way to the way Louis Jordan did, except, definitely not as prolific as far as charting and recording success, in the commercial space. But as far as his style and what he brought to light, definitely contributed in the moving forward of music. Because, with a lot of these artists, especially these singers, Louis Jordan was a saxophone player, but I think a lot of it was, for him, was curating his band. And, a lot of these backup bands, they're not going to see the same success as their lead main guy. And so a lot of these guys may only play with with Louis Jordan. Louis Jordan, the Timpani Five. The Timpani Five might only play with Louis Jordan, but there's a good chance that before and after, they, had played and, were playing in other disciplines like jazz or other blues bands or guys who were just doing different stuff. And as I said before, the urbanization aspect, people coming into these urban spaces and people collaborating in ways they haven't done before, kind of all comes together to create these new sounds. Like with Louis Jordan, as I briefly mentioned, I think last time, is that all his songs are not necessarily written by him, but doesn't matter because they put them out and they were super successful. But I think a lot of it is the whole collaboration of the band versus someone like Muddy Waters, who's kind of coming up this way, taking a genre of music or a style of music that was a lot more individual in some ways, and kind of recreating that sound, maybe not the song itself, but recreating the sound and turning that into something seemingly completely different, versus I think the Louis Jordans and people like that were taking sounds that were maybe already out there but turning into their own. But most importantly, just the popularity and prolific success that they had really got that sound out there. And however they were influenced, however they collaborated to create the sounds, now was really out there, and people were able to take that sound and make their own styles, emulate that, continue to spread the message, because that was during this time between the 1950s and 1960s, it was just a huge explosion of music. It's it's pretty dramatic. And when you're talking about cities, we're also including the DJs like Al Benson or DJs everywhere, but most importantly, these DJs who are playing these new genres of music. And so not only are you having the musicians and people coming to the cities and being interact, but now you're having these radio stations, broadcasting to a denser, larger population of people. So just more people are getting involved pretty rapidly and getting exposed to these sounds. So, not to take anything away from these guys, like definitely not Louis Jordan. It's not really disputable. The contribution that these guys have and gals have given the timeline, but it's a little bit different. Like with Roy Brown, in a similar way. He was a singer. A lot of these guys are identifying bandmates to some extent. They are creating the sound. I think with Good Rockin' Tonight, obviously he wrote the lyrics and he hummed the song to people, so he had like a flow and a general melody. But how much Roy Brown actually designed the sounds, I think a lot of that would go to the bands, and I think some of the backup bands and the guys who are contributing to this might be left out, but are a huge portion of moving moving music forward. And so, Roy Brown important, but I think it's important to also take that into consideration. But great singer. If you ever, like I said, definitely check him out if you haven't heard him before. Really great voice, a really good songwriter. And then that'll take us to our last individual on the timeline. And we got another electric blues guy, and that is T-Bone Walker. And T-Bone Walker, another very famous individual, especially for blues. He is from Texas. His family moved to Dallas when his mother moved to escape a strict religious family, and his dad was also not trying to work in the fields anymore, trying to get out of plantation work. This is in the early 1900s. So T-Bone Walker, early on, one of his first sort of jobs, he was a kid at the time, but he was a guide for Blind Lemon Jefferson, who I believe I briefly mentioned when we were talking about some of the other blues artists, probably around maybe Charlie Patton or somewhere around that time period. And so Blind Lemon Jefferson was a well-known blues musician, but he was, as kind of implied, he was blind, and so he needed a guide. And when he came to the city, T-Bone Walker would help him out, and he would try to collect tips in the process. Another musical influence for him when he was a kid was his father played in a string band. It was called the Dallas String Band. And so Walker had the opportunity to learn, a variety of different string instruments. His first guitar was actually a cigar box guitar. And I think I don't remember if I've mentioned what a cigar box guitar is on the show before, but it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a cigar box, which I don't even know, if people really know what that is anymore. But it's kind of it's kind of like a medium-sized box. I don't know what to compare it to, but not a huge box. And obviously you would take the top off, and you would string a neck to it, and then you would you attach like a little neck, and you would take some strings, wire in this case, and you would nail the wire across the top of the box so you could play it like a guitar. And so he mostly taught himself to play guitar. Reportedly, later on, he had some other sort of odd performing acts as he went along. One job was he performed in Dr. Breeding's medicine show. He was a tap dancer during that time, actually. And I don't know if people are familiar with what medicine shows are, but back in the day, I'm not familiar with Dr. Breeding, so I've never been able to find anything about that specific medicine show. But medicine shows were not, relatively speaking, biomedicine is, fairly new science, in the grand scheme of things. And so back in the day, you would have these medical professionals. For those of you listening, I keep forgetting that some people are only listening. So this is not the first time I've done quotes on this episode. So hopefully you can tell by my voice that I am making quotes. But right now I'm quoting, medical professionals would put on medicine shows, and these medicine shows were not, I would say they were not necessarily about medicine or sex. So, a lot of these medicine shows were definitely they were selling what people refer to as snake oil. So, essentially unproven medical remedies. Another thing to keep in mind is that part of this is during the Prohibition. And so a lot of these medicines that they were selling, quotes again, medicines, they happen to be have high percentages, very high percentages of alcohol in them. So, but they weren't alcohol, they were medicine, so it was okay. They also have often contained high levels of other types of, drugs, like, they'd be like have stimulants. They would have high amounts of like opium or an opiate, that type of stuff. And so perhaps, they did help with certain medical ailments, but I think the general consensus or well-accepted consensus is that the medicine shows were not really about medicine. They were about selling, various tinctures and potions that had various properties to individuals. And a huge component of it was just considering the times that, these were, sort of live traveling shows, performances, and you would have entertainers. Some of them, unfortunately, did contain blackface performances. Like I said, I don't know about Dr. Breeding's medicine show. That's why, one of the reasons I wanted to look it up, because I know just when we're talking about minstrel shows and vaudeville and all these different forms of entertainment, a lot of them contained that at the time, so I wasn't sure. And a lot of the other people we've mentioned on these timelines at some point encountered, blackface performances or different forms of entertainment where that was part of the show. But anyways, medicine shows are interesting, a little bit of an interesting thing if you ever want to look them up if you're not already familiar. Kind of an interesting phenomenon for those times. T-Bone Walker also played with Fats Waller and Louis Armstrong early on in his career for short gigs. Eventually he moved to LA, and after moving to LA is when he really started to record a little bit more semi-professionally. He recorded his first song with Les Height called the T-Bone Blues in 1939, which became his one of his first successful recordings, even though it was independent. And another thing about the first recording about the T-Bone Blues is that he was not playing guitar on the original recording, but it is one of the first songs that you can point out that people will recognize him for. But T-Bone Walker was, I think he actually took on the electric guitar before Muddy Waters. I think he started playing electric guitar at the very end of the 1930s, late 1930s, maybe mid 1930s. So he was huge in shaping electric blues. In comparison to Muddy Waters, he definitely owned it. He definitely adapted it to styles that would be consistent with like the West Coast blues. And so he was playing like a more contemporary sound that was more consistent with some of the other artists, what younger artists were shifting to, and he definitely helped shape that. In addition to being a skilled guitarist and singer, he was also a very good showman, similar to Charlie Patton, when I talked about him a while back, I think episode 2 maybe. Charlie Patton was known for a lot of his different gimmicks and showman tricks, and T-Bone Walker played or did a lot of the same things and other things. He was known for playing behind his head while doing the splits. He would play the guitar with his teeth. He was definitely that was definitely a component of his performance. And outside of Charlie Patton, I think he probably, up until this point, is probably the most well known for that. A lot of people will look at T-Bone Walker as one of the early people who did that, but then a lot of people don't know that Charlie Patton was famous for that. I think T-Bone Walker might be more widely known for those type of performance showman type acts, at least to this point in the timeline. He was a very good guitarist, though. You don't want to overshadow his guitar playing ability with the showman pieces. He had a very unique style of rhythm and tempo changes. He definitely constructed his own sound, and I think it was very key for electric blues and electric guitar, because all of a sudden with electric guitar, the guitar really becomes more capable of becoming a solo instrument. So we were able to, a lot of these young musicians, including T-Bone Walker, were really working on crafting their own styles and bring different approaches to music in a much different way than these Delta blues guys, who are really worried about. A lot of these guys were really worried about rhythm guitar, and a lot less about maybe being able to focus on some lead aspects or some solo aspects, because of course electric guitar really completely changes that, even though we're not necessarily talking about overdriven guitar or a lot of gain where you're we have like these solos that we would associate with rock and roll. But even, if you listen to, early Muddy Waters, for example, even that amplification, that little bit of drive that amps had at the time, or even that was enough to give a pretty significant, electric guitar sound. It's definitely not the same as just using a clean tone, as what people might refer to it today. Is clean tone is kind of like almost like an electric acoustic sound, except it's clearly an electric guitar. But you don't get that overdrive. It's just gonna sound like a kind of like when people play acoustic guitar into a microphone. It's not exactly the same, but that would be the comparison. Whereas some of these early guitars, just because of the style of the pickups and the amplification, they almost jumped into a little bit of a drive sound. So that you definitely could clearly solo and clearly have a solo presence and add much more lead and individuality into your song, especially if you had a second guitarist there to play rhythm. So in 1947, he recorded probably his most famous hit, called Stormy Monday, and he also at the time recorded T-Bone Shuffle, which is also a fairly well-known song by him. And what's interesting actually about Call It Stormy Monday is that it is one of his few slow blues hits, even though it's probably his most well-known hits. And I think some people actually with Call It Stormy Monday would consider it one of the greatest blues songs of all time, just because of the timing. It's pretty, considering when he released it, it's pretty ahead of its, even though it's a slow blues song, it's seen as pretty ahead of its time as far as the style, and just really T-Bone Walker's knowledge and proficiency on guitars is pretty unique, considering that, the electric guitar was brand new at the time, as far as, playing it in the style that we would associate with electric blues and slow blues, much more down the road. And so as I kind of mentioned, T-Bone Walker's style was definitely in contrast to the Chicago style that was developing in Chicago, the electric blues style that was developing in Chicago. And so, a lot of people will contrast these two styles as they were evolving. Essentially what people are talking about is T-Bone Walker versus Muddy Waters, generally speaking. And they're talking about the West Coast blues, West Coast or Texas electric blues, more commonly included a horn section, which T-Bone Walker commonly included like a horn or a saxophone section. And Chicago blues, Muddy Waters, as I said, Muddy Waters kind of took that Delta blues and shifted it into electric blues kind of directly. And so what you got is, guitar and harmonica, and kind of that style. So I wouldn't, that is definitely was common in early Chicago blues, specifically if you're emulating Muddy Waters. But as the two genres evolved, there's a lot of crossover. I don't know if you could just take all the Chicago blues and all the West Coast blues and necessarily point out those differences across bands, because there's definitely a lot of crossover and artists doing their own thing that didn't necessarily follow that format. And I think when people talk about that sort of contrast, they're really just talking about T-Bone Walker and Muddy Waters more so than actually contrasting the two styles as they evolved. Because at the end of the day, I mean, with T-Bone Walker also, took a Delta blues path as far as, his early playing and early influences, and just went in a different direction with it. And I think that he just didn't. He was just trying to make something completely different and completely new that revolved more around the electric guitar, where Muddy Waters, as I said, was kind of just continuing on that Delta blues path and just adding electric amplification. So I think, it was more of it was less location based and more just kind of what each artist was trying to do. And if you just look at the other artists who come out at different times, or sorry, not different times, at around the same time, they would have different styles, that aren't necessarily reflective of West Coast blues or Chicago blues, at least when people refer to it in that way. So another song that's a good example of T-Bone Walker's unique style is Tell Me What's the Reason, which was released in 1951. T-Bone Walker, continued his success in the 1950s. He had started to have numerous medical problems. He had an ulcer that I think occurred early in the 1950s, or maybe it was even before then. And he was also in a car accident. But basically, the ulcer continued to impact him till the end of his career. But he continued to tour. He just toured less, essentially. In the 1960s, he toured Europe, and it started with the first American Folk Blues Festival of 1962. And I maybe should have included the American Folk Blues Festival on the timeline. Basically, the American Folk Blues Festival was really the first major blues festival of its time, or it was a big festival, but was held in Europe. It was held in different parts of Europe. And what's interesting about that is that, the blues is, a core pillar of American music, and the first blues festival, large-scale blues festival, was held in Europe. With that said, it's not like blues artists weren't touring around the U.S. and weren't receiving some recognition and success. You would see some blues artists included in some jazz festivals, but it is a little bit interesting that the first large-scale blues festival was in Europe, and basically over time, every major blues player, musician played in the American Folk Blues Festival. It was a really big deal, and it lasted for several years. So over those years, probably any household name or any blues artist that you can probably recall, that was at least pretty well known, played over there, and some people weren't well known. And it was big because number one, for blues musicians, it was the first time that a lot of them had toured outside of the U.S., but also for Europe and the UK, this was, for a lot of people, was the first exposure to the blues, and especially, as far as live concert, first exposure. I mean, as I talked about, a handful of artists who were successful had the opportunity to travel in England and Europe, but, it was a much smaller amount, and now you have a reoccurring annual blues festival that people can attend, and it was going to different parts of Europe, and so it was a big deal, and like I said, it is it could have been included on the timeline as an event. I think in some ways, though, it's almost not a standalone event, but or series of events, but if you look at the timeline and just where we're progressing or headed towards, it's kind of like history. The future is already being etched out. And the festival doesn't necessarily impact that direction. However, obviously, with all these blues artists playing in Europe during that period of time, it was right before the British invasion, and a lot of, sorry, I probably shouldn't just say it like that. It was right before when all the musicians from Europe or England, blues rock guys came over and were successful in the U.S., known as the British invasion. And so obviously, it being a few years before that, it means that those seeds have already been sown, and some of these guys are probably already playing blues-influenced music. But with that said, I know the Rolling Stones were said to be in the audience. A lot of guys were said to have, attended these festivals and certainly got influence from them. But I think as far as from the American music's perspective, you can't deny that the blues music, British invasion, blues rock invasion didn't impact, the future trajectory of like rock and roll and everything as far as it relates to black music. But at the same time, as far as where these musicians are headed, developing, rock and roll is already taking place, taking shape, and I'm not sure how, that would have impacted it. I think it definitely impacts the commercial success, the success of a lot of these other musicians, because, of course, when we had the blues rock British invasion, we saw a resurgence of, folk music, blues, Delta blues. A lot of people just became like much more interested in not only the current but the past blues musicians. So that was huge, I think, in kind of gaining momentum there, and that probably helped fuel rock and some of the later genres like funk, and just through awareness and exposure. So I mean, it could have been included in the timeline. I also understand why it wasn't. But regardless, it's something to look into, because when you talk about live performances captured from a lot of the blues greats, the American Folk Blues Festival is actually, it has some of the most well documented footage of some of these musicians in their prime, or close to their prime, and especially during this time period. So it's definitely something to look into. So back to T-Bone Walker. He continued to tour after these major tours in Europe and back in the U.S. He toured on and off into the 1970s until he finally passed away due to complications from bronchial pneumonia in 1975. But T-Bone Walker was, unquestionably influenced a number of later musicians. He had a truly unique style. He really made electric blues his own, and in the process really laid a template for a lot of the later blues musicians who would come along. Let's see, he influenced guys like Lowell Fulson, who was another West Coast guy, B.B. King, Guitar Slim, Chuck Berry, Freddie King, Albert Collins, and a ton of other guys in blues, rock and roll, and all of that. Really, definitely a key person, and maybe one of the most prolific musicians on the timeline so far, potentially. All these guys are important and key, but T-Bone Walker is definitely a huge one. And let's see, with that, I think that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in once again to the Blue Lineage. If you haven't already, definitely subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, continue to watch on podcasts if you prefer to listen. We're on most of the big podcast platforms, and I appreciate everyone following along, especially in this early process while they're just completing this timeline. To me it's fun, but I think unless you're a hardcore music fan, maybe we don't hit on some topics that might be relevant to you, but just stay tuned. I'm sure some of these artists will pique your interest, hopefully, and then later on, we'll get into some more discussions that kind of pertain more to current life. What's going on in music history today. What does the future look like? Stuff like that. But still have a little ways to go. So please keep tuning in to listen to the Blue Lineage Black American music timeline. And until next time, take care.